Hello everyone, and welcome to this video, which is in our Polishing the Classics series, a series in which we analyse classic endgames together with our engines and discover some amazing new ideas and plans. I'm Grandmaster Matthew Sadler, and we're looking at the game between Tigran Petrosian and Mikhail Botvinnik. It's a very famous game. Petrosian exchanged off queens very early and then proceeded to outplay the great Botvinnik in a queenless middle game. There were, however, many interesting moments along the way, and we are going to be focusing on one particular one, a possible transition to a pure rook endgame. What I'm going to do first of all is to show you the rest of the game, because there are some interesting themes that we'll see later in our analysis, and then afterwards we're going to focus on that crucial moment. In the current position, Petrosian is on top. Petrosian is white, Botvinnik is black. White has rook and knight against rook and bishop. The German endgame specialist Grandmaster Carsten Müller calls this the Petrosian-Ulf Andersson endgame, because both Tigran Petrosian and the great Swedish endgame specialist Ulf Andersson loved playing with rook and knight against rook and bishop. Black pawn structure not great. 4 pawn islands, an isolated pawn on e6 and a pawn on c3 that's so far advanced you sort of know that one's going to get lost. It's certainly going to be attacked by all 3 of white's pieces. However, black does have some chances for counterplay. In particular, the rook on c8 has quite a lot of scope, both along the c file, possibly coming to a square like c4 to attack a4, or along the d file. There's also possibilities for the rook to swing over to the king side and start creating some havoc there. So Petrosian carried on with knight e4, bishop a5, king d3, rounding up that pawn, also stopping the black rook from playing rook c4 and attacking a4 and e4. So Botvinnik decided that it was time to activate the rook, give up the pawn on c3, that was happening anyway, and then get the most activity from the rook. Now, there was one crucial moment here, and this is the moment that we'll come back to later. But Botvinnik decided to play the move rook h1 here, attacking the pawn on h2. And what you now saw was that Petrosian managed extremely effectively to combine the power of all of his pieces, the king, the knight, and the rook. And this is really, one of the secrets of endgame play. You don't have very many pieces, so you really need to make the most of each of them. And, well, in the game, just compare what Petrosian manages with his king, knight, and rook, together with what Botvinnik manages with his bishop on a5, rook on h1, and king on e7. And you'll see how disconnected the black pieces seem and how connected the white pieces seem. So knight e4 played, rook h2, king d4. And the king sort of moves towards the centre, towards an invasion point into the black position, and the rook threatens to come into c7. And with the knight here on e4, covering black escape squares on d6 and f6 is a very serious threat. So black defends it with king d7, g3, and other moves were possible. The engine very much like knight f6, king d8, f4, followed by king e5 takes e6, but okay, that's a matter of taste really. g3 played by Petrosian, nice and safe. And after bishop b4, king e5, rook check, king f6, bishop e7, king g7. I mean, I've had games like this where I've boldly advanced my king forwards in the endgame and then found out that it had overshot its mark and wasn't actually attacking anything important. But actually black's got a very big problem here because, well, first of all, these pawns are pretty important, the kingside ones. And secondly, the black king's in a bit of danger. A rook d2 check could really embarrass the king. And you're going to see that in the game. Whilst black looks for counterplay with the rook h1, maybe to a1, then white is actually encroaching both on the bishop and then also on the king. You'll notice as well that this knight on e4 is an absolute beauty. It defends the pawn on f2, which frees the rook on c6 for active operation. If the knight wasn't there, I think there'd be a big problem, when white advances with the rook. And yeah, that's a theme that we'll also see later in our analysis. So rook a1 played, rook e6, bishop d8, rook d6 check, king e8. All these moves with tempo, black very short of squares for the bishop. King obviously also a bit short of squares. And when that happens, the tactics will come, sort of work your way. So bishop c7, rook c6, very important here that rook takes a4 allows knight c3, and then the knight's coming into d5 and attacking the c7 bishop, just winning a piece. So black sort of avoids that and plays rook d1, goes passive again, but knight g5, king f7, king g8, and here Botvinnik resigned. I mean, we've got two threats. Either we're going to grab the h7 and then the g6 pawns, or we're just going to come to e6, swap off all the pieces, and then just win the pawns anyway with the king. So just a very easy win there for Petrosian. So that was beautifully smooth, very nice technique, power of combined pieces really in the endgame. But let's go back to that crucial moment on move 33. Where Botvinnik went after the pawns with rook h1, but in actual fact he could have played bishop takes c3, and then let's just say king c3. A lot of arrows there, yeah. It's now in actual fact, when you look at the position, how the game went afterwards, and you see how magnificent the knight on e4 was and how useless the bishop on a5 was, you sort of think, well, obviously this was the only way to play for black, and many commentators have pointed it out as the best option. I mean, really, it's a huge error of judgment by Botvinnik, not to do this. However, I think it certainly shows that human players do have some problems, assessing transitions to pure rook endgames. I think that's difficult even for the strongest of players. And I'm sure that that Botvinnik wasn't really very positive about this rook ending, and so decided to keep pieces on for counterplay. But obviously it turned out very, very badly here. So what feels wrong about this rook endgame? Well, I mean, the pawn structure is ugly. Got this isolated pawn. We've got this open c file. The rook can come into c7 with check. And then it would attack a7 and h7. These pawns are advanced, so they give a nice outpost on c6 for the rook. So, sounds pretty good, really, doesn't it? However, there are a couple of problems, really, and one of the key things we've talked about already is that you need to combine your pieces to win, and really, White needs to combine the king and the rook in this position. In order to stand a chance of winning, and certainly you'd be looking for an entry point for the white king. But if you're looking at that, then you sort of realise that actually these pawns on a4 and b5, strong though they are, they create a backward pawn on a7 here. They're actually blocking the white king from invading on the queen side. So actually, there's only one invasion point for white, and it's through the centre. But actually that's not so difficult to block. I mean, at the moment this rook on d1 is covering the d file, so the king can't get over, and we've also got some moves like king d6 or king f6 just to stop the pawn, the king, from coming to e5. Now you might say to me, but Matthew, in the previous game White's threat of rook c7 forced the black king to defend the invasion point, and then the king moved in all the way up to g7, and that is absolutely true. However, in the Petrosian game, one of the key things was that you had this knight on e4 gluing together the king side. The pawn came to g3, then the knight's defending f2, the knight's invulnerable. So actually, we don't need to worry at all about this rook. This rook is absolutely free because the knight's defending f2 whilst, also being a magnificent piece, attacking f6 and d6. But in the pure rook ending, we don't have that at all. So, if White's rook invades, then the white kingside pawns here will also be vulnerable to a black rook that's pretty active, so we'll get cracking quite quickly. And this is one of the key things to realise in this endgame, that black shouldn't be defending passively on the queen side with the king. Black should be actually getting the king maximum active, pushing forwards the kingside pawns, and then just be ready to pounce on these white kingside pawns when white invades on the c-file and starts nibbling away at black's queenside. And of course, if the black king is active on f6, the white king has no entry points. And actually, these two things, well, certainly these things, about not being able to combine the pieces very well together because the white king's got no entry point. I mean, that's really important for black's defensive prospects. I mean, the other thing is that, in the endgames that we've looked at previously, that's Capablanca Ragozin and Smyslov Konstantinopolski, white had already made a remote pass pawn, either an A pawn or a C pawn, with which to play with. But, here white hasn't got that, and to create it is not at all easy. How do you create a pass pawn, on the king side here? There's, the king's in the way, first of all, and these pawns are a nice barrier. So, really with white, to create a pass pawn, you're going to have to reach out, stretch yourself, put a rook into the opposing opponent's position, and then just start grabbing pawns. But that means that, your attempts to create pass pawn, it's never riskless, because black's going to get a pass pawn too with these kingside pawns. So actually you can see, quite some obstacles for white for making anything of his pawn advantage. And in fact, my engines were managing to hold this with black, just 100% of the time, unless I asked them to do something silly. Just going to have a look at a few interesting ideas there. One of them was that what if white takes with a rook on c3 here? I go rook d2 on the 7th, and then king b3. I'm threatening two things. I'm threatening to play rook c2, just defending my my 7th rank with tempo. I'm also threatening rook c7 check. The king's just moved back cleverly to allow that. But notice that in the Petrosian game, white was playing king c4 to d4, bringing the king into the center, and then allowing the rook to come here. Here, because of this barrier on the d file with the rook here, the king's got to move away from the center, so not any closer to doing any damage. And very typically here, black springs into action. No defending the queen side, you just grab the pawns. This is, however, a very important moment, and here the engines find the stunning move, rook e2. Why can't you play rook g2? Have a little think about it. The problem is that you go rook b7, king c5, rook c5 check, and actually black cannot defend the b pawn. And after rook h2, rook b6, both sides have got connected pass pawns on their respective flanks, but whites are more advanced and whites are faster. And yeah, I mean, this just was always turning out as a win for white. This is Komodo Dragon against Leela, e4 check, a5. That was just a pawn sacrifice, not to win the pawn on e6, but just to grab the push the black king a little bit further away. g5, rook b7, g4, a7. You can see how much faster white is. b6, king c6, b7, and yeah, the pawn's just queen with a win for white. So yeah, I mean, very impressive actually play, but yeah, a real example why you can't just take on g2. But actually, black's got this gorgeous move here that we're just playing rook e2. And what's the idea of that? The idea is that after rook b7, we go rook takes e3 check. And now two things are important to notice. First of all, that king can't run. It's got no invasion points into the queen side, so it's just completely stuck, which means that we can check it very profitably. It either has to stay close to the a pawn when we can check it indefinitely, or it moves a bit away, and then we come in with king c5. And well, if you check me on c7, I'm just going to go king b4. I'm going to pick up that pawn, and it's not going to be a problem. And I've still got my rook e2 takes g2 and h2 threats as well. So rook e2's, a really lovely move there. And after that move, then, it's just basically a draw there. So, I think already, you're seeing some typical themes here. The restriction of the king that makes it vulnerable to checks, the weakness of the a4 pawn, that theme of not trying to just defend the queen side passively, as Botvinnik had to do against Petrosian, but really exploiting the fact that the white king side pawns are vulnerable and going for those as soon as you can as well. So another interesting little variation, that's king c3. And now what does black play here? Well, my engines were playing either h5 or g5. The idea is, what are we doing? We are going to get our pawns as far as possible so that when we start grabbing these pawns here, f2, g2, h2, we're going to be as close to queening as we possibly can be. So h4, this was quite typical. King f6, the king again abandoning the queen side, but we're looking to play g5 and yeah, open up the king side here. So what can white do? White's got a number of plans. I think we'll just go through one of them, which is quite instructive. Rook d2. You just want to chase away the rook from the d file. You know, after all, that's blocking the white king. But you know, you go rook c1 check, and after king d4, we just go rook a1, and the a4 pawn is weak. And there's no way for the white king to use the time it's been given. You know, it can't come in through d5 or c5. So the king has to keep on coming back. But when it comes back to the second rank, which is basically the only place it can avoid the checks, we come here and attack the pawn. And that means that if the rook moves, then we take the pawn, not only the pawn, but we take it with check. And this is, again, very typical in rook endings here. You know, we're just checking, making a piece put itself to a slightly worse square, then going back to our daily business there. And, well, the engines played around a little bit. Then I made them play f3. And then rook g1, for example, was played by a dragon against Stockfish. And rook c2, we go g5, and we're threatening, yeah, king h4 to g3. I mean, we're already getting our counterplay seriously going, and then h4 to h3. So white plays rook c7, rook check, rook f2, f4 check, king g4, and this is quite a a complicated position. White's taking on a7, black's pushing the h pawn, but black's no worse here. You know, I mean, black's got plenty of counterplay, more than enough. So that's very, very interesting there, and I think you can see a lot of the themes there about the difficulty that that white has in getting the king active, getting into black's position, and yeah, the activity of the black rook and black's desire to push the kingside pawns as far as possible, get the counterplay as turbocharged as possible once the pawn race starts. I mean, one thing that interested me very much was, so what happens if the white king, could get active in some way? Well, it can't happen normally, in this position. But one engine game that caught my attention went knight c3, rook h1, and then here Petrosian played knight e4, which is great, of course. But the engines weren't even bothered. They didn't say knight e4. They said just king d4. Get the king into the center, and if you go bishop takes c3, rook c3, this rook ending is winning. It makes that much difference having the white king cut off along the d file by the black rook, or being able to come into the center. And yeah, I mean, we'll just have a look at one variation just to give you an idea. So king d7, stopping the rook from coming into the 7th rank. I mean, the point is that the only reason this really worked in the previous line was because we had a rook being able to chase the king away from and allow the king into to defend. With king d6 to c5. Here, yeah, there's no such thing. The king's well protected. There's still lots of pawns on the board. The rook's out hitting the pawn on h2, not doing damage on f2 and g2. So black plays king d7 to stop. We go h3, f4, rook takes g2. Very nice structure this for white. Just rook covering c3, the pawn covering the a4 pawn along the rank, and now the king is coming in. And yeah, black's got a number of defenses, but none of them are good enough, actually. So g5, we go king f6, and then this gorgeous move, rook d3 check, causing the king some problems. If you go away to c7, I'm going to take on f4, and if you go back to e8, then I go e takes f4, and yeah, I was wondering whether should this really be lost, but my engines were adamant, and obviously there's a huge quality difference in the strength of the kings respectively, and even the rooks actually. So rook d6 coming in here. I've got threats of rook e6 check, of f5, or of rook c6 to c7, and well, my engine game, this is crystal against dragon, just ended like this. f5 check, rook a6, we pick up b6, and then it's just over. So yeah, I mean, that activity of the king made a huge difference, and I think that's maybe a clue as to why Botvinnik might have been wondering a little bit about, should I transpose to this rook ending, because it doesn't take very much for white to be in a completely winning position. Only if black plays it carefully and exploits the fact that he has a rook on d1. To stop the white king from crossing over too early, and just give black the opportunity to get himself organised and ready. Then if white doesn't have that, then it's actually just very close to a draw there. The one other interesting thing I did was I just wondered what would happen if the white pawn wasn't on b5, if it was on b2. Would that make a huge difference? And I really thought it would, because what are we doing with this? Well, with the pawn on b5, of course, we're not restricting the black queenside pawns, but we are giving the white king a path into the queenside. So actually in this position, very similar to Capablanca-Ragozin, the white king has got a path both into the queenside and also into the kingside. So you would have thought that this would give you a big advantage, and indeed, the position after bishop takes c3 in the Petrosian-Botvinnik game, that was 0.3 for white, so a very small advantage according to my engines. This was close to 1.5. So for an ending, that's well, it's not completely won yet, but it's getting very close to it. And it was very intriguing to see how it came about, because it reminded me very much of what we'd looked at with Capablanca-Ragozin. So white sets up the king side there, and then plays king b4, king d7, b3. And yeah, I mean, black's a little bit nervous, doesn't want white to play a5, so keeping the rook on there and putting the pawns on there. a6 is stopping the king from getting into b5, of course. But now some interesting play from white here. This is Crystal again against Komodo. Rook b1 played to stop the king coming back to b2, and then rook a2, and we're looking for a5 there. Just creating a weakness of this pawn, and also introducing, if the pawn moves from b6 goes to b5, well, we also get a path into the queenside then. So a5 played, stopping that move a4 to a5. But now, of course, we've got our entry channel back, c4, b5. And a very interesting thing is that just as in Capablanca-Ragozin, this check on the d-file is giving black an enormous dilemma. Do you want to go to the king side when white will just invade here? Or do you want to go to the queen side when, well, if you go to the queen side, we just do what the engines were doing in that Capablanca-Ragozin example. We go to the king side, so we are going to try and invade here and start grabbing pawns. You can win my h-pawn, but I'll get some back on the way. So black does, we saw this many times. Black runs over to the king side, and you say, okay, run over to the king side. Annoying, I'm blocked, but I am threatening rook d6 here, and it's here that the weakness of the black pawn chain really tells, because rook d6 is going to pick up at least 2 pawns, definitely the e6 pawn and probably the b6 pawn as well. So black plays rook c1 to give a check after on c5 after rook d6. Absolutely, but he's no longer attacking the h3 pawn. And then the king goes back to d4. And what is white doing? What is clever white doing? White is aiming to play rook c3 here, get the rook off the c-file, and then afterwards come into the queen side. The black king moved over to the king side, so white's now looking to come into the queen side. Again, this total shift, this flexibility, in fact, about where you're going to win the game, that we saw in all the examples with Capablanca-Ragozin, we're seeing in this game as well, which is very nice, I think. I like seeing that very much. So, Komodo was quite ingenious here. So, forcing a white pawn to b5, so the king can't get in. But of course, this is a much less solid structure than we saw before. And white's got no problems breaking it. We just come around to a4 now. Black trying to stop the king coming into a4. But yeah, you can't stay there forever. And well, I mean, what position have we got here? We've got, you know, this great position now where we started off in this type of position with a black rook active and seemingly, you know, all sorts of counterplay against the kingside pawns, and give us a few moves, and you know, we're in this position with the white kingside. There's no idea of it being under threat. The black rook passive, the king really attacking an important pawn there, and then white just starts advancing on the king side, going to start creating a pass pawn on the king side, what you always wanted to do, and then that's just going to be curtains in the end. So yeah, I mean, that was a brilliant play, very Ragozin, Capablanca Ragozin like, you know, which I thought was very, very interesting. You know, I think it's a, you know, very typical idea in endings, this idea of being flexible with your king in a rook and pawn ending, and just looking to, you know, to go either way in entry paths into the file, into the opponent's position. And yeah, I found it very interesting as well to see what a difference it made for the white king to be active. You just give white a little bit of something, you know, here in this position, an entry path from the queen side, or, you know, being able to cross over quickly to d4 by moving the rook away to the corner in h1, and the whole assessment of the ending was changing enormously. So you know, I think that shows just it's kind of a fraught ending for black, but still, you know, it was very clearly the best decision, and well, certainly with the benefit of hindsight, seeing the horrors that befell Botvinnik in this game, really would have been a sensible decision to go for the rook ending. So there we are. I hope you enjoyed. I hope you learned you know, quite a bit from that. I really felt I did, just by analysing it. You know, if you like the video, why not give me a like or even subscribe to keep informed and up to date about the huge number of videos that are coming out on this channel. Maybe even take a look at my new book, The Silicon Road to Chess Improvement, which is masses of interesting insights about how to train with engines in particular, and also lots of game analysis of brilliant openings, middle games, and endgames from the best players in the universe. And otherwise, you know, thanks very much for watching this video, and hopefully see you at the next one.